So we decided to drop this bonus episode on a Friday because TFMR Awareness Day is on May 4th, which is a Saturday this year. And we really wanted to reach that community, especially because Erica has been such a big part of that community and helping get them more resources. So I am just here to sort of introduce the episode. We're going to kick it off with an interview from someone who actually reached out via email to us after listening to the first episode of our podcast and was willing to share their story. And then we will get into some voicemails that Erica asked the TFMR community to leave us about their stories. I don't want to take up too much time talking because I really want you guys to be able to listen to all of these stories and the just courage and vulnerability of these parents to call in and share their really heartbreaking stories of baby loss. As this is a TFMR Awareness Day episode, the subject matter is sensitive and will contain discussion about termination for medical reasons, abortion, and baby loss. On a personal note, I just want to say how grateful I am to Erica for sharing so openly and honestly. I've talked about this in our previous podcast episodes, but she just inspired me so much in the way that she dealt with her grief. And it wasn't always like this inspiring, pretty thing. She had a lot of messy, sad moments. But I'm just so honored to have been there to support her and to watch her create this beautiful community online of other women and parents who are going through a similar situation to what she went through with her daughter Shayla. So let's kick it off with our interview with Brooke. We were like, how can we use our clinical skills and our friendship to like start talking about things that people don't want to talk about and, you know, just kind of like make it more normal, like just really normalize it, the grieving experience. Because while the circumstances are different for everyone, I think there's like a thread that kind of ties us all together. And so that's what we sort of noticed. And it seems like you noticed that too in listening to our podcast, and then you reached out. So if you don't mind just sharing a little bit about what urged you to reach out or even listen in the first place.
Right. So, yes, I listened to your first episode, and I found you on Instagram because I was seeking for grief support. And I really connected, like you said, you know, that no matter what type of grief somebody is, or what kind of experience that leads to grief, in different experiences, but that we can all kind of feel connected and comforted because I listened to the first episode and certainly felt connected because I recently went through a TFMR in January of 2024, so just a few months ago.
Yeah.
And so that's after listening to that episode, really felt an urge to reach out just because I felt a sense of not feeling alone in that no matter what type of grief, yes, Erica, who you also experienced a TFMR. So there was that personal connection, but I just really felt an urge to reach out and just to normalize, like you mentioned, Jordy, of these difficult experiences and conversations, and just being able to support each other.
I'm really glad that you reached out and that you found, like, I think for Jordy Nights, we are hoping that someone finds it when they need it. And it sounds like it hit you and it found you when you needed it. And I got a few details from your story, but it sounds like there's a lot of layers of grief, and it's not just the termination. It was the journey, the whole reproductive journey has been filled with grief. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that journey in your story.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, you hit it saying layers of grief. So Yes, so I am 39 years old, and I've always wanted to be a mother, and that's been my dream. And I never met, I always wanted to meet a partner and kind of have that picture perfect timeline of meeting a partner and falling in love and entering marriage and then children. And I turned 34 and kind of started to I met a friend who decided to freeze her eggs. And so I also, hit 34 and really was okay. I really want to be a mother, and I want to make the best choice for the healthiest, pregnancy of using those 34-year-old eggs. And so I froze my eggs at 34. And then 39 hit, and I went through a grieving process there that okay, I am 39 and I am just not finding, a partner. And that was a grieving process in itself, because I felt, and have been in therapy for many years, and really my therapist was tremendous in walking me through that type of that grief, in that it was a grief of never having, a loss that I never found.
Yeah.
And so I did go through a period of grief, grieving that.
That makes
And
sense. I feel like with that too, there has to be a lot of processing done to get to the point where you're making the decision, I want to unfreeze my eggs and make embryos and get pregnant.
yes,
Like that's not an easy, I can imagine, not an easy or quick decision to make. There's
No.
months and interventions and finances involved.
yes, yeah. It was a trying time for sure.
Yeah.
And so then, I pulled the trigger, and, I still had hope for the future and finding a partner, but I kind of said, what do you want to do with your life? If you cannot, you know, find a partner and have this kind of family, would you still want to be a mother and take this on as a single mother by choice? And that was a very obvious yes.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a huge, support system with my parents living 5 minutes away from me, and just friends supporting me. Felt very loved, and so it was such a relief. It was such a sense of joy that, okay, I'm going to do this. And then I felt like I did all the right things, that I froze my eggs at 34. So, and I'm healthy, and, going through the fertility process, where, my doctors, looked at, I had all the ultrasounds and blood work, and everything looked great. All my levels looked great. And, I was just trying to stay positive, and I felt so much joy. So I did, create the embryos, and I went in for an embryo transfer. It was August 30th, this past August. And I kind of went into it being like, I don't know what I have to lose. My doctor said 60 to 70% chance it would work. And I kind of was just going into it like, I don't know, it's my first try. Let's stay positive and hopeful. And I did get pregnant.
Wow.
And it was it was just I felt such joy. And also just once I became pregnant, and yes, I was holding my breath a little bit or nervous of just kind of, I think it was, but there was just this sense of like joy and excitement, and my future is going to begin. And it was such a weight lifted off of me, of the whole grieving process in the past of I never found that partner. And so it was just kind of like, but look, like, well, look what's ahead of you.
Right.
And
You
so
saw
I
like this
felt,
life and future that you really envisioned, that even though it was like you had to first get into this idea of what family looked like for you. And then once it sounds like once you got that idea of my family could have looked like this, you got on board and sounded like you were really hopeful, and the grief was still there maybe, but not in the forefront of your mind.
Yeah, I like
yes,
the way you said that. Like you just got on board with it. Like you worked through the grieving of like what you thought a family would look like, and then made peace with that, and then chose what your family would look like, and were like more in acceptance of that. And I can imagine a lot of joy
absolutely.
in
Yeah,
that.
that's, so it was such an exciting time for my family and I. And, um, my pregnancy was just easy. And I felt great. Going through the first 12 weeks, there was a little bit of nausea, but the ultrasounds, everything looked wonderful. I transitioned to my regular
Mm.
OBGYN. Um, I went through the NIPT test, and that was negative. And my world was turned upside down on December 26th of 2023. I went for my anatomy scan, and unfortunately, that's when, the technician picked up on it right away, and explained that there was fluid in my daughter's ventricles,
Mhm.
the right and left ventricles, and fluid on the brain.
Mm.
And I was by myself, which was extremely scary. I had this, my friends and my family always asked, "Do you want me to go to your appointments with you?" And I had this like drive that, no, I can do this. I'm choosing to be a single mother by choice. I'm proud of this and I can
Yeah.
handle it. And so it was terrible. It was devastating. I just remember just tears flowing and then the
And what did
maternal.
you know at that point? So when they told you fluid in the ventricles, did they tell you what that meant?
So the lab that so yeah so yes, after the technician told me that, I was waiting for the maternal fetal medicine doctor to come in and really present the results. And yes, I was told from the anatomy scan that my daughter, Anna, had severe ventricular megaly in both the right and left ventricles of her brain. Um, and I believe the doctor said severe hydrocephalus. I believe they could see the fluid in the brain at that appointment. And the doctor said this is very serious, and immediately set me up to go. I live in the Chicago area, so
Mm.
he set me up to go to um, a hospital for where I would have an amniocentesis, and meet with a genetic counselor. So that afternoon was when I got to my car and was bawling and called my parents, and they came and picked me up, and we drove to the hospital.
You had the anatomy scan and then you went into your car. Did you have that? Did you go straight to the hospital or was this like lined up for a different time?
Thankfully, I went straight to the
Wow.
hospital. They were able to get me in that afternoon.
Wow.
That's so quick.
Yes.
What was going through your mind at this point? Because I remember like your mind kind of shuts down and it's hard to process things. Like you're just going through the motions. I'm just curious for you. Do you remember what was going through your mind at this point in the car?
Well, I was inconsolable. I was crying hysterically, and I was terrified. I was terrified. The doctor just, the words, "This is very, very, very serious." And I just was thinking in my head, something is terribly wrong with Anna. Something is terribly wrong with Anna. We need to do this next step. I called my parents. And that's what it was. I was in shock. It was my body physically, was immediately, I just couldn't eat. I couldn't drink. I couldn't, and thankfully that, yes, they got me in right away.
And then once you got in, did they initially present termination as an option, or how did they talk to you about options?
Right. So we met with a genetic counselor first, and she explained the severe ventricular megaly and the severe hydrocephalus, and also suspected an absent corpus callosum. And they first explained about the recommended genetic testing results. And that's when my doctor came in. And I remember we said, what do people do in this situation? Because, which I'm glad it panned out the way it did, because what the doctor was saying is referring me to neonatologist, referring me to pediatric neurology, and he did touch on the severity, and that and I will bring up the topic of gray area, in that, yes, I was still waiting on the fetal MRI results, because that I needed to wait a couple days for. But, with her diagnosis, yes, everything was in the severity range. But from what I remember, I mean, I think it was, what do people do with this diagnosis? And that's when he said, I like how he worded this. He said, most people choose to not continue the pregnancy. And, that's when I lost it again, and was just in so much shock. And I could feel her move. I also went through this because my body was so physically sick, with this news, and I wasn't eating, and I felt so sick that I could really start to feel her move then, and it just was, it was just so hard.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine that day. It's like all the dreams crashing, and you already had gone through so much intentionality and thoughtfulness and planning to get to this point. It's like such a wanted pregnancy for you, and know what that's like, and can imagine what that day was like for you.
I had to, go home and process all this news, and lay out the pros and cons, is what I did with my doctor. And I was so, which I'm sure people who undergo TFMR, I could see doing the same thing, but I couldn't let go of trying to read literature on research articles with her same diagnosis. And I mean, hours and hours and hours and hours. And, there's a difference between isolated ventricular megaly and non-isolated ventricular megaly. And my daughter had non-isolated. She had multiple anomalies.
Mm-hmm.
It was a gray area though, and that's
And
what,
you keep coming back to the gray point,
Yeah.
and to me it sounds, I mean, I don't know how many people actually get this is 100% fatal. Doctors can't give that information, so I think that's the hard part. But when you list all of the issues with Anna, it seems like quite clear that she would, I don't even know if she would technically make it, and it sounds like she would require a lot of interventions from the moment if she made it to birth, would have to undergo.
yes,
Right. And like just sort of asking yourself what that quality of life would look like. It's a
right,
hard set of questions to ask yourself.
right. And that's what led to my decision is, I do still struggle with having, it's gut wrenching. It is cruel to have to be put in that position
Yeah.
to make a choice. But ultimately, I know I made the right choice for my daughter, and I'm taking away her pain and suffering. I'm taking on the pain and
Yeah.
suffering.
Mm-hmm.
Because I feel it wouldn't have been right to put her through. And yes, that there was a potential that with the severity of her case that she wouldn't have made it till term,
Yeah.
or that my life may have been in risk because of a high risk C-section because of her brain, or the swelling.
Mhm.
So but I do still struggle, and I think what women, couples that had to undergo this tragic TFMR, it's I feel like it's going to be hard with
Oh, yeah.
having to make that choice for the rest of your life.
Yeah. I mean, you're so like you're only months out, and I feel like those are the roughest moments, like the first few months of like how do you get back into life? And it's always like I feel like I'll be changed forever. Um, and and it's like your daughter has a name and her name is Anna, and you did take on that pain to spare her. And I guess I have one question for you is like what's been the most surprising part about your grief?
I think what's been surprising is my strength. Um, I do have a history of anxiety and depression. And I have had some darker days in my past. And with this happening, I was worried for myself, but
Yeah.
I feel surprised in how well I am doing. And it is why do I think I'm doing so well? I think there's many reasons. The first thing that comes to mind, though, is I feel it's a maternal strength in me that
Oh,
like, you are a mother and you will have hope and you will be a mother someday. Um, and I just feel like that is part of me, and I'm proud in that I feel I am handling this really well given the circumstances. So I do feel that maternal strength in me, but also therapy, pouring myself into therapy, seeking, grief support, and just my friends and family lifting me up and using some of those strategies that I know have helped me in the past. I've been able to apply going through, you know, my grieving
yeah.
process. And
Well,
so,
it's
yeah.
really beautiful talking about the maternal strength.
Yeah.
I can echo that and I can see that in you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I really appreciate you sharing your story. And by sharing, I know so many people will feel like how you felt not alone by listening.
Yeah.
Other TFMR parents will get that same benefit from you now.
I hope so. I really appreciate you letting me share my story. I hope it reaches others, and thank you.
Thank you. We so appreciate you sharing your story and sharing a piece of Anna with us. Thank you so much to Brooke for being willing to speak with us on her lunch break. It was very last minute and very courageous of her to share her story. It was the first time she was really sharing this story publicly, and we felt so honored that she chose to share with us and share her daughter Anna with us. So thank you to Brooke, and we've tagged her on Instagram if you want to go learn a little bit more about her story. So Erica reached out to the TFMR community and she asked you guys to call in and leave us voicemails, and we got a bunch of voicemails, which was so awesome. And the stories were so similar and also so different, and it was really interesting to listen to. And so Erica will be responding to a few of these voicemails that were left for us, as a fellow TFMR parent, as a clinical psychologist, and just sort of giving feedback, advice, thoughts on the themes that she recognizes in each of these stories. Thank you to all the callers who left voicemails. We realized before we didn't realize when we actually put out this request that our Google Voice would cut people off at 3 minutes, which was completely our fault. We had no idea. So thank you to the people that called back multiple times and tried to get their story finished and all the way in. We realized that 3 minutes is not enough time to share your full story. So thank you for your patience, and we will come up with a better system next time.
I had to TFMR just this past January of 2024. I found out at the anatomy scan that my son, Benny, had a giant omphalocele, which means that his internal organs were developing in a sac outside of his belly. The prognosis for my son was just awful. I unfortunately didn't have enough time to really be able to get second opinions because we were right up against the abortion laws in the state of Wisconsin. Although I know that these other opinions wouldn't have changed the decision, I know we made the right decision for my son so that he is not in pain. He'll never know a life of pain and suffering. It's just so hard to still look back and think that these laws had such a profound decision on our timeline that we couldn't maybe come to the decision with some more time to think about it. It felt so rushed. I did have an intuition before any of the scans said something was wrong. I just had this nagging feeling that I'd never be able to hold my son in my arms, that we weren't going to bring him home. And it was something that really bothered me, and I brought it up to doctors, and all the tests were coming back great. The 8-week scan looked great, and it wasn't until the anatomy scan that everything came crashing down.
So I really appreciate this mom calling in about her son, Benny, and how devastating to find out at the anatomy scan that her son didn't have organs developing inside of his body. Something that she highlighted here was not having enough time in coming up against abortion laws and the need to make a decision quickly and it feeling really rushed. And although this mom probably likely would have come to the same conclusion around termination, it really also puts it into perspective that there are lawmakers working against women like us, and we have not the ability to take our time to find research to make the decision. When we think about the abortion laws, it all comes down to viability, age, and how many weeks the baby is in utero. But then when you hear these stories, it really puts it into perspective of here's this mom who couldn't get a second opinion because she was up against an abortion law. And then it creates another layer of grief that we're doing something wrong, that something isn't legal, and therefore we need to make a decision now. And if I
can imagine this mom who is able to get a second opinion and get that level of reassurance that she's making the right decision. And it is this level of severity that she would be able to have more of that acceptance that she did what she could as a mom. And again, could have come to the same decision, but could have mentally and emotionally felt better about that decision.
I had a TFMR on March 12th of this year. It was my first pregnancy. My son was diagnosed with trisomy 18, which is not compatible with life. I had a 95% chance of miscarriage. If he, by some miracle, made it to term, I'm a NICU nurse by trade, and I've seen a lot of babies in pain, and I didn't want that to be him. I think this grief is different because I'm not just grieving the loss of my son, but the loss of the idea of being a parent, being someone's mom. I lost my dad about a year ago, and I have memories of him, and I can, recall happy moments, but I don't really have a lot of happy moments from my pregnancy. And so when I go back to those memories, I don't have anything to look at. But your podcast is really great. It helps people feel seen. Thank you.
So when your child dies, you obviously grieve the loss of your child. But what a lot of people don't really talk about are the secondary losses that come from this type of grief. And what I mean by secondary losses is not only do you lose your baby, you lose all of the ideas you had about their future and even your own future. If you had thought about them taking their first steps or what it would be like to have a child growing up and going to the elementary school down your street, when your child dies, so do some of those ideas about motherhood. And it can kind of rock your worldview when your child dies or when your baby dies. And I think for this mom specifically, she really highlights that the grief is really layered and multifaceted and generalizes to a lot of different areas of one's life. And it can also be really hard when your baby dies to not have memories and meaning making and continuing and creating connections with your baby once they've passed can feel really great at times and can help with some of those secondary losses. And this mom really highlights that it can be really hard when you have this idea of your baby, but you don't have a lot of tangible items. And what I like to say is it's really best to find ways that you feel connected to your baby that work for you. And sometimes that can be through tangible items, but other times it can be an emotional connection. I remember when I was doing yoga at the beach after my daughter, she had died, and I felt the sun beating on my face. And I remember it was the first time I actually felt connected to Shayla through beauty and not through pain. And I didn't have anything tangible in that moment. So it is possible. And I hope this mom at some point can feel connected to her baby without having those tangible items.
We found out through the NIPS test that he was likely to have one of two things, either triploidy or he was likely to be a vanishing twin. Of course, it turned out that he did indeed have triploidy, which is not a diagnosis that is viable after birth. Through more imaging and tests, we found out a laundry list of things that were not going to be compatible with life for him. It was since we live in the state of Texas, our options were very limited. And thankfully I was with a group that was from the get-go, very supportive and willing to assist us in any way they could, which was essentially to find us care outside the state. So at 16 weeks, my doctor began to start to call out to other doctors across the U.S., try to get us the care we needed to terminate. At my next appointment, I kind of listed off all the things that I was feeling with the doctor, the high-risk doctor, and she went ahead and sent me to emergency OB. I was showing signs of preeclampsia, and my doctors pushed for an emergent induction. So if I hadn't been with them in the state of Texas, I don't know that I would have gotten the care that I did and been able to receive care in the state. I was able to be induced and have him naturally, and so I did have essentially almost every complication that you could have with a triploidy pregnancy. Thankfully, after surgery, I was able to be with him and have time with him. I think the social and political aspects of it really dilute you being able to grieve. For me, growing up in Texas, having a very conservative family, growing up in a very religious background, even though I do not have those beliefs now as an adult or even growing up, I really strayed from a lot of those views. It's really hard to live in a place that demonizes you. I think my own parents really tried to be as supportive as they could, and they really shocked me in how supportive they were, but also I only know that runs so deep. So a lot of what I struggle with is kind of trying to block out the noise with social and political stuff and just being able to grieve and be sad, about the actual loss.
Sometimes it just makes me angry that we've been through enough. We've lost our baby. We've had to go through the devastating position of terminating our pregnancy for medical reasons. And then it's politicized. And this mom said something that just runs so deep to my core. And she said, it's hard to live in a place that demonizes you. And that gave me the chills because living in Los Angeles, I feel so grateful that I had medical providers and I had access to medical interventions. And it makes me so sad that so many parents all over the country and world have politicians working against them. So that when they're in their grieving process, like as parents, when you're in the grieving process, it's hard to just grieve because there's this layer of feeling like you're being judged every time you leave your house. So this is a nod to all the parents out there who have been in the position of feeling judged or politicized, is that you are compassionate parents and you've made the best decision that you can with the information at the time. And I just hate that it has come down to a political matter in a state that pushes you out to receive medical intervention. That's literally a basic human right.
I wanted to talk about maternal TFMR because sometimes maternal health TFMR is not as discussed in the TFMR community. I have 2 children, and my husband and I were really excited to have a third. We went through a whole process of trying to restore our fertility to have that third because I had immense health issues that put a stop to us having kids for more than 7 years. And then I got pregnant last year, but unfortunately a series of really intense events where I was in some really intense situations that I hadn't prepared for beforehand led to recurring panic attacks, weeks of sleep loss, basically mental health spiraling, immense shutdowns to the point where I was nonverbal and unable to communicate anymore. At the time, I didn't realize that it was a product of a lot of trauma, CPTSD, and the fact that I have autism. But at the time, it just felt like I was dying. And there were some just serious health signs that we saw that were just really concerning. And we didn't know if I was going to make it through the pregnancy. So we made the heartbreaking decision to say goodbye. And that was the worst day of my entire life. And held my belly and thanked this little light for being in my life and said, I'm sorry I can't do this. I'm sorry I can't carry you. My health is just not going to make it.
There are some stories that we don't hear as much about when we're in the TFMR community speaking to other parents, and that's the story of maternal health reasons. And even more so, we hear even fewer stories around maternal mental health. And it's such an important story to tell because I know that this mom is really not alone. And as you could hear from sharing her story, it sounds like she was really desperate and wanting this pregnancy to be okay. And yet her own health was decompensating. And I've actually spoken to a lot of parents in the past who have been in this same position. And terminating the pregnancy is the thing that brings them back to their baseline of functioning. But then there can be a spiral of guilt afterwards around still wanting to have and bring a baby into this world, but not knowing and having the uncertainty about how they will be within their own health in a subsequent pregnancy. Either way, it's such a devastating position to be in, to terminate and lose your baby. And it's such a hard position to be in when you're considering your own health and not knowing, I guess, in that moment, if termination would save her. But that was the only thing that likely did save her and likely saves other parents out there. I really appreciate this mom calling in to share her story because it's a story that needs to be told. And I hope that if you need to hear it, that you were able to find us today and hear this mom's story.
Prior to my TFMR, my husband and I had 2 healthy pregnancies. Everything was pretty much going normal with the pregnancy. I was a little bit more nauseous than I normally had been with my other 2 pregnancies. Fast forward to my anatomy scan day. My husband and my 3-year-old came with me, but it did take her a pretty long time to do the scan, and then when she was done, she left some of the pictures of his head up on the screen, and we sat for a very long time, and my husband and I started getting nervous. I looked at the pictures of his head up on the screen, and it looked like almost like a lemon shape. Finally, the OBGYN came in with maternal fetal medicine, and she immediately sat down and told us that our son had spina bifida, and it was the most serious form. My husband and I immediately started crying. I'm a nurse, and I know exactly what that means. I know that it's a lifelong disability. We knew we had 3 options. We could do potentially in utero surgery. If we were candidates, we were told that we could terminate the pregnancy. And the third option would be to carry him to term, have a C-section most likely, and repair his back at that point. And then just basically deal with the consequences of his disability at that time. 2 weeks later, we went out to Texas Children's. We went through 2 days of grueling testing and then another day of meetings. It was very exhausting. It was very hard emotionally and physically. So we were in Texas, and we came home and decided that the benefits did not outweigh the risks to having in utero surgery. We decided that keeping the pregnancy would not be an option without doing in utero surgery. So we decided to terminate the pregnancy. We spent 2 weeks grueling over it and trying to make sure that we were making the best decision possible for our son and for our family. And we unfortunately went past our deadline to terminate here in South Carolina, which is at 22 weeks. So we again had to travel up to Pennsylvania. We went through a program called PEACE with the University of Penn to terminate the pregnancy. And on October 19th, we ended the pregnancy. and lost our son. I am not the same, and I will never be the same person that I was prior to October 19th, 2022. It changed me beyond anything that I imagined. I think that this type of loss is so much different than other types of losses because I feel like I lost a part of myself that day in October. A part of myself died that day. And as far as it being different from other types of baby loss, I do think it is different because I had to choose to end my son's life.
So this mom really spoke about the difficulty in making the decision to end the pregnancy without having the information around uterine surgery. So as you can tell, this mom, she went out of the state and went to the top hospital and learned more about surgery. It sounds like she was considering carrying this pregnancy to term. And once she learned more about the benefits and risks of the uterine surgery, came to the decision point to end her pregnancy. And I think that's such a hard position to be in. Do I put my, at this point, fetus at risk of having the surgery? And then you're considering the risk to your own self of having uterine surgery. And again, no one can tell you with 100% certainty if those risks will occur or not. And so it reminds me a lot of when parents do decide to carry their pregnancies to term and their baby is born and they remove medical intervention. So in this story, the mom is saying how the pregnancy wouldn't really be able to carry on. This pregnancy wouldn't be viable without the uterine surgery. And so by declining that surgery, it would have been safer to terminate. It reminds me very much of the example of a mom carrying her baby to term, having birth, and then removing medical intervention and providing comfort care. Either way, even though there's so many differences in termination for medical reasons compared to different types of loss, at the end of the day, there's also a lot of similarities in loss. And at the end of the day, if you've experienced baby loss, you lose your baby. And we all experience those secondary losses. Specifically with termination for medical reasons, it's really that extra layer of trauma and grief. And as I've alluded to before, after undergoing 2 miscarriages and losing my pregnancies, when I was in the position of making the decision to terminate, I prayed for miscarriage. There's just something that no one can really understand what that experience is like to make that decision. Baby loss is the only type of grief where a baby dies within you or where you have death occur inside of you without dying yourself. It's like this really unique type of grief and loss. And I hope by putting this episode together, you've been able to hear from women who just love their babies. Like, these stories are stories of love. These are stories of compassion. You hear all of these moms talking with their voice shaking because it's just so emotional and raw and vulnerable. These are babies who these women really wanted to parent in the real world, and under these circumstances were not able to. I just really appreciate all of them calling in and sharing their stories with me. And I hope you got some insight and are able to feel less alone in hearing these stories. And so if any of these resonated with you, we'd love to hear from you. Love to know what resonated for you. And let's smash the freaking stigma that comes along with termination for medical reasons. Thanks everyone for listening along.
Thanks so much for listening to Grief Street. We put out new episodes every Monday. If you'd like to support us, give us a follow on Instagram and TikTok. Also, subscribe to our YouTube channel to find the video version of our episodes. Please subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts and give us a 5-star review. We would love to hear from you and get some feedback. If you'd like to contact us, please email griefstreetpodcast@gmail.com or leave us a voicemail at 508-474-3378. That's 508-GRIEFST. Our theme song is Hepcat Jive, courtesy of purpleplanet.com. We'll see you next time.